Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So, as always, hopefully you're having a great Monday, and that, hopefully your day is over. Even if you're on the West Coast, it's 3 p.m. That's practically the end of the day. So, if you're new here, welcome to Shop Talk. The idea of Shop Talk, it really helps to unmute. No, I'm not on mute. I am most certainly not on mute. You might be on mute, Anders. You're just shouting in the wind. But you were. Okay. So, Shop Talk, in case you are new to this whole thing, this is our semi-weekly get-together where we talk about various topics and sometimes inflict unnecessary dramatic pauses like that on the viewers. So, with me over here, we've got Mala. How you doing, Mala?
Good evening, everyone. Nice to be here.
And in chat, we have Anders. Hope you're doing well, Anders, although you may have just gone and turned off the speaker again. But just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about tonight, I've got a couple of articles already queued up. And in case there was any doubt, article number 1 is most certainly going to be on CrowdStrike. I was preparing to upgrade 20-ish instances to SQL Server 2022. Hey, that's not bad. Hopefully that upgrade goes well. But hopefully it goes better than what CrowdStrike did. So you got that. Hopefully you'll have that going for you. So a couple of weeks back, CrowdStrike had a big oopsie. It definitely ranks up there as an oopsie. And there are some articles that are shaken out. We have prepared for 12 minutes versus their 0. It sure seems that way. So there have been some articles that have shaken out about what has happened with the recent CrowdStrike fun. I'll call it fun because I didn't have to deal with it. Although, Mala, you had to deal with it some, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Would you consider it fun?
Certainly not my idea of fun.
Yeah, I would agree. And we don't have...
The hardest part was until we got to the point where we found out that it was some outside issue that affected, a lot of the rest of the world. I think everybody took the same route, that we thought it was something weird going on in our environment and our DBAs. Thankfully, one of those times when I was grateful I was not a DBA. I knew stuff was happening, but Mark and his team were up literally 4-5 hours before they realized, hey, this is something happening world over. So that was the hardest part. After we realized that it was something like that, then things started to ease up a bit. But
yeah. So in case somebody's been living under a rock for the past couple of weeks, there were interesting consequences to this software release. And so Mala dropped this article on what caused the CrowdStrike outage. Scrolling down just a little bit, basically their CrowdStrike Falcon platform is a solution that hooks into the Windows OS as a kernel process. If you go back to the days of Windows 98 and blue screens left and right, Microsoft eventually realized that the large majority of blue screens happened because of crappy drivers. People wrote really poor driver code. It wasn't necessarily the operating system was faulty. It was the drivers are faulty, and the operating system is giving those drivers way too much capability to ruin the system. And so you would have any sort of failure, any sort of unchecked condition could lead to a kernel panic, the Windows equivalent of a kernel panic, which is a blue screen. Well, what Microsoft then did in the Windows 2000 and XP lines is that they cut out the capability of a lot of software to work in kernel space and even cut back on what drivers themselves were allowed to access. And this works really well because now your crappy driver will just crash your application versus the entire Windows operating system. Usually, sometimes you can still blue screen. It is It is still very possible to get blue screens, but they are much more rare. I mean, you go back to the Windows 98 days, and it was literally reboot every day so that you wouldn't have failures. And now we can go at least 2 or 3 days without having to reboot a machine. So got that going for us. Then Anders needed good graphics drivers for gaming. Yeah, that's a problem. But long story of this, basically the CrowdStrike software has to run as a kernel process, because what it's doing is it is monitoring for malicious behavior, and it cannot do so from user space. So it needs to get privileged access into the operating system to make sure that, well, nothing else has privileged access into the operating system and is doing something malicious. So that's the intent of this software. It bypasses many of the safety checks that exist in modern Windows to limit the damage that a single piece of software can cause. And there was an issue in a sensor configuration update where apparently this channel file 291 was pushed out, and it was supposed to prevent a third-party attack around using named pipes in Microsoft Windows. So named pipes, for SQL Server people, we may remember it as this is one of the 4 options that are available to you for process communication in SQL Server. And named pipes are a fine thing. They're a good way of communicating within a single machine. Normally, we'll do TCP between machines, but named pipes can be faster on a single machine. So named pipes themselves are not bad, but there was a malicious software going around that was using named pipes to communicate as part of a command and control system. And what was happening was that, well, CrowdStrike put out this channel file 291.sys, which had a problem. Now, people don't necessarily know what the problem is, but we do have an idea that it did affect about 8.5 million Windows devices, which, when you hear the Microsoft people talking, they're like, oh, that's not even 1% of Microsoft's global Windows install base. Which is true. Yes, it was a less than 1%. However, that 1% does not include Mima and Papa's desktop computers. It doesn't include your laptop. It doesn't include the machines that are less relevant. It includes, say, like the machines that Delta Airlines and America Airlines are using for their route management. It includes most of the complex infrastructure. And part of the reason is that VC companies really drove CrowdStrike in particular as threat management system of choice. And so a lot of companies in this critical infrastructure space got tied in closely with CrowdStrike, and this affected all of them while leaving it so that regular user machines were still fine. So Microsoft could easily say, yeah, 99% of computers are still fine. That's cool, but when it delays your flight out from Atlanta by 3 days, it doesn't matter that 99% of computers are fine, because the 1% that are down are the ones that are affecting your life right now. And that's another part of this. So grounded thousands of flights worldwide, led to significant delays and cancellations of more than 10,000 flights, and hit all 3 major U.S. airlines. And our man on the inside, flights, banking, real estate closings, yeah, it affected a lot of things. But our man on the inside, Marshall, who sometimes chats in here, was keeping us up to date on what was going on in Atlanta over that weekend, where everything was just a real mess. And it took days for things to come back to approaching normal. By the time I flew out later that week, things were fine. We might have been seeing the last remnants of needing to shuffle around flights, but it seems like the airlines had their systems back together by then. But it took a while, because part of the issue was you needed to perform a like physical reboot of a machine in order to get it to work. Or if you're running a virtual machine, you can restart it 15 times, and then that would drop you into safe mode. Which, when I first heard of this, I was like, really? 15 times? This seems kind of dumb. But then as I thought about it, it's like, okay, when you think about a virtual machine where you cannot just physically restart it, or you don't have access to, like, think about anything that's in a cloud provider, it is at least good that there is a way to force into safe mode. And 15 reboots is, I suppose, very unlikely to occur in a manner in which you would want this to happen without going into safe mode. So I suppose it's a good answer. It's just kind of silly that it's 15 and not 14 or 10 or 8 or whatever. Like, it has to be 15. That was the part.
That's unbelievable, Kevin.
Yeah, it was a little silly, but at the same time, hey, this worked. And there's also 911 emergency services being affected in certain states. Anders mentioned financial services, people who didn't get their paychecks as they expected. And, oh yeah, Sky News. So Sky News in particular, I remember them, they were down, and then as they were trying to get back up, they had to go with zero graphics. So basically you got television news from the 1980s in terms of broadcast quality, where it was just people sitting there and you didn't have all the graphics on screen and all the nice cutovers and everything, these effects and cryons and all that. It was just people sitting at a desk talking. So that so there were some good things. Okay, so that had some large worldwide effects. And there's a little bit here on, hey, well, why did this not affect Apple, macOS, and various Linux kernels? Because this was a sensor update that was specifically for Windows. That was Windows named pipes. It could just as easily have affected Macs and Linux machines. So the people who were out there going, oh, this is Linux superiority or macOS superiority, it could just as easily as affected those other systems, because they also need kernel level access on Mac OS and on Linux. So we got lucky. And actually, there was a reported incident in June where a Falcon sensor triggered a kernel panic. And this was issued without Red Hat reporting any major incidents. So it can happen. It does happen. It didn't happen to the same extent. But yeah, this wasn't really a Windows thing. Haven't watched it all yet, but he's pretty reliable. Okay, I'll have to check that out later. Won't be able to do it right now, but Solomon has a link in chat for a YouTube video from a retired Microsoft engineer. And I also, because I wanted to get another take on it, I said, hey, how about the register? Now, the register has a habit of being like, 80% sensationalist, but it's still fun to read. And we come down here. A lot of the story is the same, talking about the same C291 issue. And there was a little bit more information as we get further down, which was talking about this fellow who dug a bit deeper into the code and realized that there was a bad pointer dereference that came as a result. It was trying to access a particular memory address that doesn't exist, that is not accessible. And basically what was happening was the kernel would say, oh, that's not accessible memory. There's a problem. And this is what caused the Windows kernel to say, we have an issue. I need to throw a blue screen. We need to reboot, because it's trying to access some set of memory that it shouldn't be able to access and can't access. So then there was a complicating issue with the way Windows driver architecture works. Drivers can set a flag called boot start so that if there is an issue, you can restart the machine without loading that driver. And, well, CrowdStrike doesn't want that because the whole idea is it needs to be able to monitor, that Falcon program needs to be able to monitor any other processes that are running. So you don't want to have a malicious process maybe try to drop a bad file into the directory that Falcon will read and say, oh, I don't know how to read this correctly. I'm going to reboot and turn off the Falcon program so that the malicious software can go and do its thing without even anybody noticing. So makes perfect sense why this flag would be set, but led to the consequence that, well, if there is a problem, you need to take a specific action. And I don't know that this in parentheses is actually correct. So Microsoft did recommend people reboot VMs 15 times. My understanding was that there was a special bit of logic in there for reboots, a certain number of reboots, versus just trying to win a race condition. So I could be wrong on that. That this actually could be correct, but this is the first time I'm reading about that. Nonetheless.
So how do they say that 15 times is when the race condition would resolve? I don't get that. How is that possible?
The idea is that there's some, so this is where usually when they're talking about Windows, this is where the register shows some of its bias. But the general idea is that I'm reading the article. Yeah, I'm not even going to open this one up because this seems like a little bit too sensationalist. But what they're saying here is that there's a race condition. You're going to have either this thing complete or this thing complete. And if this thing completes first, then you're okay. If this thing completes first, then you've got a problem. So this thing completed first, reboot, try again. Oh, this completed first, reboot, try again. This completed first. Great, we're good now. When Falcon not started before reboot, increment counter by 1. Just put that up on the door, like 0 days since last catastrophe. 0 reboots since last catastrophe. But again, I don't know that this is actually correct. And I'm not sure that I would trust the register for detailed information on that in that regard. But still, what I should do is, for the edification of chat, I'll drop a link to the register article and also to this Tech Target article. There we go. Man, we only have that for WAF. And if you didn't have it for endpoint detection, then it wasn't a problem. But, well, this is what happens with endpoint detection sometimes. That any piece of software can have problems, and at some point, the piece of software will have problems. This is why we can't have nice things. Speaking of why we can't have nice things, that was possibly my greatest segue of this week. Here is an article that I found. I can't remember where I found it, but anyone can access deleted and private repo data on GitHub. And by the way, that's by design. So let's talk a little bit about this. So they're introducing a term, cross-fork object reference, and considering that a vulnerability. GitHub, by the way, considers this normal behavior and say this isn't a security vulnerability, this is normal behavior. But let's talk about the process. The general idea is that I have a repository. So Mala she forks my repository. Then maybe I commit code. So Mala commits some code to her fork and then deletes the fork. This is, a normal process. The idea would be Mala has forked my repository. She's going to commit some code on her side, and then she'll create a pull request to bring it back over to my main repo. And then I'll approve the pull request, and then she'll delete her fork. So this is a pretty common way of being able to work with a GitHub repository, especially an open source repo, where you don't want a whole bunch of people to have commit rights to the repository. So they'll work on it in their own, and then they can do a pull request off of a fork back to your repository as a way of synchronizing things. So this is a standard practice. This is not a really special idea. It's been around for quite some time. The tricky part is if Mala committed code to this fork and then deleted the fork without doing a pull request, without doing anything else special, the idea would be, this is no longer accessible because you deleted the fork. And the thing is, it is actually accessible. So there is a video on how this works, but I am going to skip the video and talk about it a little bit. So here's the further path. You can also discover the commit hash. So just because you don't have a commit hash doesn't mean you can't get it. But we surveyed a few, literally 3. Okay. So you surveyed OpenAI from a large AI company. Hint, it was OpenAI. And found 40 valid API keys from deleted forks. That's a problem. So the user pattern, what's happening here is this is a training. You can see it's examples/something.ipynb. This is maybe a learning exercise. So you fork the repo. You then are asked, hey, hard code your key into this repository file in this location as part of the tutorial, the training. It would say, in practice, we know you shouldn't do this, but this is really easy to do. So we'll have you put it in this file, and then you'll commit that file to your fork. You'll continue the tutorial. You'll wrap up the tutorial, and then, hey, delete the fork, and everything's fine. But it turns out that it works both ways. So you can access people's deleted forks and commits and get potentially things like API keys, but you can also say that I've got a public repository. Mala forks my repo. I commit some data after Mala performs the fork, and Mala never syncs the fork. And then later on, I delete my repository. I say, this is no longer a public repository. Is the code that you committed after Mala forked my repo still accessible? And the answer is yes. And all of this has to do with the way that GitHub works with repositories and forks. So there is a repository network, and here's a network graph that shows some of the idea. In a normal situation, you'll have an upstream repository, and that upstream repository, for example, would be my public repo. So Mala forks, Solomon forks, Anders, maybe Anders forks off of what Mala did. Just you have normal processes, and I have some commits. So I commit. Well, then I delete this repo, and I say, I am no longer making this available to people. Well, the thing is, Mala still got a fork. Solomon still got a fork. Anders, despite claiming he doesn't use GitHub, still secretly has a fork with a different account. And the new upstream is actually still there. So this is my deleted repo, but there's still an upstream because we need something to be able to handle these forks. And, well, these commits then get tied back to the upstream repo, which means that everybody can grab those commits, even though none of the original forks that still exist actually had those commits or links to those commits. And again, GitHub's response is that this is standard behavior. This is not a security vulnerability. This is just the way that things work. So in here, and I think there's a little bit of sensationalism here. I think it's not great, but this is more of you need to learn how to use the product versus, oh my gosh, this is a massive vulnerability. So I submitted a priority 1 vulnerability to a major tech company showing they accidentally committed a private key for an employee's GitHub account that had significant access to their entire GitHub organization. They immediately deleted the repository, but because it had been forked, I could still access the commit containing the sensitive data via a fork, despite the fork never syncing with the original upstream repository. And the risk as a result is that if you have forks enabled and you have commits that you don't want people to see, they could potentially see them. Now, if this is a major tech company, my question is, why are you not using GitHub Advanced Security? I understand GitHub Enterprise Cloud is a little expensive, but if you are a major tech company, you should probably pay to turn that thing on, because then it wouldn't have allowed that commit at all. So would have prevented the commit of any sort of private keys, or use Git on-prem. Yeah, you could use Git on premises as well, or turn off forks. That's another idea. But accessing private repo data. So we have a private repo, and there's a private internal version of that repo that's forked, and you commit additional code for features that you're not going to make public. Your upstream repo is public, but the fork is private. Well, you can see those private features in the fork. Basically, forks introduce a realm of... I've switched to using sporks. That seems like a good idea, Solomon. It's half of the utility of a fork, half of the utility of a spoon, and more punctures in your against your lips. So it seems reasonable. VSS, you get out of here with that. Rock solid and safe. Oh, so you mentioned this. I actually had to do a VSS to Git migration recently, and I wasn't sure the tools would still work. They do actually still work, but I was shocked. I'm like, when's the last time you updated this server? Actually, don't tell me that, because the server was running, it was Windows Server 2008. It wasn't even Windows Server 2008 R2, as I recall. I think it was just straight up 2008. So, sad for SQL DBA stuff. VSS worked well. For SQL DBA stuff, VSS worked fairly well. If you're the only person using it, maybe. The problem was, as soon as you had two people trying to use the same repo, that's where you get all kinds of locking issues and absurdity. But if you're a solo person, yeah, it works okay. So yeah, private fork commits can be publicly accessible. What is this two people stuff? That's fair. Also, I read years ago a recommendation for forking projects instead of just starring them to prevent losing access if the creator deleted the original repo. Hence, this was somewhat well known. Yeah, when you fork the project, you've got the code in your own account. So it is your own copy of the code, and you can do whatever you want with it. So the idea is, from the standpoint of these researchers, their argument is you should have access to all of the commits that happened that you have pulled from the original contributors. So if I go back up to this image, the idea would be that you've created a fork of some public repo. So I've got a public repo, you've created a fork of it. And then that was 2 weeks ago. In the intervening 2 weeks, I committed some additional, made some additional commits, but you have not pulled those. You have not updated, refreshed your fork with the latest upstream changes. And then I delete my repo. I say, I'm done with this noise. And so the security researchers make the argument what ought to happen is your fork should not be able to see these things because you never synchronized. And what really happens is your fork despite the fact that upstream repo is no longer extant, um, actually still does have access to those commits because GitHub, the way that it handles forks and managing forks, requires that there be a root node to the graph. And so it creates a root node to the graph, and now everybody's linked off of it. So, yes, you're right. Forking is going to give you a copy of the code, and the argument there, and I understand, but the argument there is, well, hey, this is good. This is not great that you can get these later commits. So I would or do have access to commits ahead of my fork. Yes, that is correct. You do have access to those later commits, even if the core repository has been deleted. And there are some videos that these folks have put together on the how you would do it. And the way to access that data involves directly accessing the commits using the commit hash. So the commit hash is not a secret piece of information. It is something that we would treat as publicly accessible. So there's no secret to the hash. If you do know the commit hash, you can navigate directly to that endpoint, and you'll see that, hey, this commit does not belong to any branch of the repo. It may belong to a fork outside of the repo. And this is why I switched to using sporks. Yeah, well, this isn't a spork. Never trust crazy fins. That seems legit. Although, Torvalds didn't create GitHub. Torvalds just created Git, which is its own bundle of joy. So how do you get these hash values? Well, you can brute force them in the GitHub UI, or you can hit the API. The API will also give you hash results, as I recall. And yeah, here we go. Public events API endpoint. Because again, these are not supposed to be secret information. These are not privileged that only special people are allowed to access. This is how you are supposed to access anything that comes in GitHub. Like this is the way that you're supposed to be able to look at commit information. And GitHub's response, this is an intentional design decision. It's working as expected. Their documentation notes what happens to a fork when a repository is deleted or changes visibility. We may make this functionality more strict in the future, but don't have anything to announce right now. And after reviewing the documentation, it is clear as day that GitHub designed repositories to work like this. So yeah, this is, again, GitHub saying, hey, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but it's by design. It's did the GitHub spokesperson used to work for EA? No, that spokesperson was not nearly berating enough of the security person to have worked for EA at some point. When you change a private repo to public, all the commits in the repo, including commits made in repos it was forked into, will be visible to everyone. So again, basically GitHub saying, yes, your super vulnerability that you're so excited about is literally in our documentation. Which makes it like, again, okay, if you're saying, hey, we're groundbreaking researchers, it's there already. It was there before, is my understanding. So the issue is that the average user views the separation of private and public repos as a security boundary and understandably believes that data in a private repo cannot be accessed by public users, which is not always true. Excuse me. And the act of deletion should imply the destruction of data, which it doesn't always do because you have historical information around forks. So what can you do? One thing is you could turn off forks. Forks are an optional setting for a repository. So let me pull up one of my many repos. My many repos that are great. They're outstanding. They're the best repositories. If I pull one of these up and I say, hey, this is build a data application with Streamlit. I'm not happy with this talk right now, but I am in the process of building a bunch of videos around it. And when I'm done with those videos, I will rebuild this talk and make it a lot better. But that's not the reason we're here. The reason that we're here is that we have some capabilities around. I gotta remember where the setting is. So let me pull this up. Because I know managing the forking policy for your repository. It's in settings, drop down menu under features. Dang it. General. Features. So interesting. I don't have any option in here for forking. And what I'm looking at is this link right here that says, hey, this is how you would manage the forking policy for a repository. This is people with admin permissions for a repository, all versions of GitHub. So if you do not have access, or if you do not see this feature, you may not have access to it. But I would presume that I have access to it, considering that it is my account. So that is kind of interesting that apparently for this particular repo, build a data app with Streamlit, anybody can fork it. But there ought to be a way to manage that forking capability. And this is the link that I dropped into chat, where it does indicate that you should be able to, in the feature selection, select allow forking. So there may be something I'm missing. It could actually be there, but it's not there. Sounds like it needs a copy without forking option. Copy without forking is cloning. I mean, you clone it and you push it up into your own repository. So you would clone here, or just straight up download a zip file and create your own repo. I know that's a couple extra steps. The whole idea of forking is this is to make life easier for making a copy and then make a copy and then attach into your own account. But then you could not merge it back in. Correct. You would not be able to merge that code using a pull request, because a pull request requires either that you've committed in this repository or that you have committed from a fork of the repository. And that's how GitHub can do cross-account pull requests, is via forking. So if you don't fork it like that, you have to deal with other people. That is the major problem in life. I found if you just don't have to deal with other people, life gets so much easier. Speaking of other people, our next topic. Notice two killer transitions in a row. Next topic actually came from an email from Mark Gordon. So I don't know if Mark is in the audience tonight, but regardless, Mark knows the answer now. The question was around programming languages. And so with app developers, what languages are they using today? Mark was trying to give some guidance to someone who's getting into computer science, young person, one of them youngins, and trying to offer some advice up of, should you learn C or maybe Pascal, or I'm hearing about this new language called Ruby, and basically which languages are exciting. RPG, there you go.
So Mark Wilkinson, Kevin?
No, Mark Gordon.
Oh, Mark. Okay.
Power Builder. That's a powerful language. Power Builder with Fox Pro underneath. And you got yourself a real dynamo system right there. So I gave Mark an off-the-cuff response that said, hey, okay, he mentioned C# and Java, so I was he didn't have the older languages that I mentioned. But if you think about it, if you want to feel old, Java's almost 30 years old. C# is in its 20s. So these are I don't want to call them legacy languages because they are still very common. I would call them very common back end business languages. If you are working for most companies, you are probably going to write a fair amount of your code in Java and C#, or at least within the company, a lot of developers are writing in Java or C#. There will be other languages, and this is specifically application development, so explicitly excluding SQL. But I mentioned to him that, yeah, C# and Java are pretty common for back-end stuff, for established companies, I'll call it that, established IT systems. However, for newer stuff, you're seeing a lot of Python, you're seeing a lot of Rust. For mobile development, Kotlin is becoming more and more popular. And for front end, it's always JavaScript, unfortunately. And it's JavaScript Framework of the Month Club, so React or Vue or whatever else you want to learn. Andrew says it doesn't matter what you learn. By the time you've learned it, it will have changed.
So
To an extent.
true.
Yeah. Yeah, and I am absolutely not going to be the person to say learn just one language and be done with it, because I literally have a talk on learning languages and the importance of learning multiple languages. So does not sound like the type of thing that I would generally recommend. And yeah, R is a great domain specific language for statistics and data science. Job control language never changes. War never changes. C and assembler, and you have a foundation for any other language. Which assembler? There are so many different types of assembler. Mumps. Mumps is the disease, not a programming language.
I love that.
Even the RPG based system Mumps is still a disease. So good news. My off the cuff, let me throw stuff at Mark Gordon. Well, I can back it up with the Stack Overflow survey for 2024. It is for hospitals. Yeah, it is. I think it was out of UMass Amherst, if I remember right. But whichever hospital inflicted that, or whichever chain inflicted that on the world, don't like it. Although, if Mike Christensen were on here, Mike would defend the honor of Mumps. He has in the past. He probably will in the future. But Mike is not here, so we can castigate Mumps to our heart's content. In the meantime, we can talk about the most popular technologies, where popularity, this is a little bit tricky of a description. So, which programming, scripting, and markup languages have you done extensive development work in over the past year, and which do you want to work in over the next year? And so the question is, well, of these, like, what are people actually doing? I've been told companies, at least in this area, are requesting Python more often than other languages, which is why Wake Early College for IT and Programming offers Python. A lot of schools, universities have moved toward Python as their language of choice for learning, for a few reasons. I mean, one of them is it is so much easier to get started with than Java or C++ or C#. There's it's easier to write console programs. There's a little bit less. Yeah, they asked companies what was most desired, and that was mentioned the most. And if you go to professional developers, I mean, you'll see here, JavaScript, 2/3 of developers are using JavaScript, which makes sense. Like I said, everything front end is JavaScript. SQL, more than half are using some variant of SQL. Makes perfect sense. And I also explicitly excluded that one because Mark was asking about application developers. HTML and CSS, same thing. You're writing front end apps. But then the first non front end or database language is Python, 46%. TypeScript, which is JavaScript with fewer mistakes, is next. And then you get to shell scripting. So you look at this and say, what are the most common languages? I mean, they use the term popular. I don't necessarily consider this a measure of avidity so much as commonality, but Java and C Sharp are right in here with about a third of users. A third of users are making good use of it. And then we get to other languages, C++, PHP, C, Go, PowerShell, Rust. So Rust and Kotlin are a little bit low, but they have shot up significantly. So this is a long tail type of phenomenon. It's where we have got so much built up code that is in Java, C Sharp, C++, C, that you're not going to see these numbers radically shift, but I think that these are shifting down over the long run. It is interesting that PowerShell is different from Bash and Shell, all shells except for PowerShell, I guess. So, we have VB, which is at this point essentially a dead language. It's been essentially a dead language for a while. I mean, VBA is more of a live language at this point than VB. Sadly, R and Scala. Scala had its run with Spark, but at this point, Python has become the norm. Hopefully I put enough emphasis on how much I dislike that, because I like Scala, but it was a niche language. It is returning to a niche language. And you're going on, you have the greatest language of all time, not Fortran, not Zig, F Sharp. Prolog, I am amazed that Prolog is actually on this list. And I am disappointed that Nim cannot beat out Prolog. Nim, by the way, if you're not familiar with it, this is intended to be a language that is trying to attack Python. It's trying to get into that same space as Python for data science, for administration, for scripting, for general purpose scripting languages, but is supposed to be a little bit more carefully designed. And it's an interesting language, but as you can see, yeah, it's way down on the list. And again, one big caveat. This is Stack Overflow. So, yeah, COBOL is 0.6%. I'll bet you in real life, there's more than 0.6% of application developers who are using COBOL, because those people are not asking questions on Stack Overflow. And they are not filling out surveys from Stack Overflow. So some languages where there is more of an insular environment, you're probably not getting the same level of commitment as in the full population of developers. That said, I do wonder, because now I'm thinking about it. That explains why PLI isn't on the list. Yeah, there's some languages in here that, they're way down. I was honestly shocked at Prolog. I didn't know anybody still used it. I thought that language died in the 80s and was just around as a warning to civilization that 5th gen AI just isn't a thing. 5th gen languages, excuse me. But stick to 4. Gen 4, great generation. It's a great generation, one of the greatest. Generation 5, not good. So I think as a quick understanding of what's going on, what's around in the market, what's around technology wise, this fits reasonably well with my biases, so I believe it is correct. But even that stated, if you are last standards release was June of 2000, that actually does sound about right. I mean, I did use Prolog in undergrad and vaguely recall it afterwards. But even in undergrad, the idea was, hey, this was a cool idea that never worked out. But if you ask me which are the languages that are most common in the business world, I think I would come up with a list that is fairly similar. I don't think I would have TypeScript as high. I don't know how much I would count shell scripting. I mean, yes, it is extremely popular, but it's also something that people use as like their fifth language. I don't know too many people who are primarily shell scripters. There are some, absolutely. I guess if you include PowerShell, that number does go up, because you have a lot of administrators who will claim, yes, sysadmins, who will claim, I'm not a programmer, and then go and write stuff in PowerShell or in Bash or in Python and say, no, I'm not a developer. I'm not developing code. And then you ask, well, what do you have? Well, no, these are scripts. It's totally different. But as a whole, yeah, Go, Rust, Kotlin, I think those are the darlings of the modern era. And we're seeing more use, more application of those languages. Like if you were going to learn a new language today and you didn't necessarily care about it for a particular job, Go or Rust or Kotlin, those would be good choices. I mean, if you don't know Python, that's probably the default choice because it is becoming a lingua franca of multiple domains, and I'm not pleased at that, but it is the way of the world. For databases, again, we have what's interesting is Oracle is so low, but I think that just comes from the fact that Stack Overflow is not where you go to get Oracle help. Why not pleased? I don't like Python as a language very much. I prefer proper functional languages. Python's attempts at being functional are weird. The whole global, like having global state in classes is weird. There are a lot of development practices that are idiosyncratic to Python, and they require you to follow, this is the one way to do it, except that I can do it 3 other ways, but those are supposedly wrong. And it's not straightforward why this is the one way and it should be the way. Lambda functions are a joke. Like what if my Lambda function goes on 2 lines? Well, who would have a Lambda function go on 2 lines? Well, you allow me only 80 characters before I violate your precious rules, because apparently we're working on terminals from the 80s. And really, my dislike stems from there are other better languages that Python has superseded in several domains, and I prefer those other languages. I write Python day in and day out. That is my day job. Quit making fun of the 80s. I like the 80s, just not those 80 character limits on terminals. So I use Python, but I don't like it. I guess that's the way I would put it. For databases, Postgres, MySQL, SQLite. So 3 open source databases are up at the top. And then SQL Server, MongoDB, Redis, MariaDB, which is an offshoot of MySQL, Elasticsearch, Oracle, Dynamo. I would not use this as your ranking of database commonality. How frequent? I think this list is mislabeled. How do you mean, Anders? But also, I should note, 41,000 people responded. So the sample size is not enormous. Should be, what languages do most people need help with? This is not the same thing. This is not them looking at their tags. This is actually asking individuals. So we had 45,000 individuals who got the question of, here's the actual question that they asked. Which programming, scripting, and markup languages have you done extensive development work in over the last year, and which do you want to work in over the next year? And they apparently had 2 checkboxes. For databases, which database environments have you done extensive development work in over the past year, and which do you want to work in over the next year? So for both of those, it's not how many questions did people ask on the topic or how many people are asking and answering questions, but rather what are you working with the caveat that most of the people answering the survey are going to be Stack Overflow users. So it is not a full sampling of the entire developer population. It is a sampling of the developer population who uses Stack Overflow. And then for cloud platforms, AWS, 50%. I was actually surprised that Google Cloud is so high. I know that Google Cloud is pushing really hard to get people to the point of where they're throwing so many freebies at people. But it did surprise me that Google Cloud is a serious player for number 2. Google has a cloud? Apparently they do. As far as web frameworks and technologies, like I mentioned, React, Angular is still very popular, which is surprising. Vue and Express are the other 2 frameworks that I'm most familiar with theoretically. jQuery hanging around because, let's face it, most of the time, I'm gonna get close to the mic because I'm telling you a secret, chat. You usually don't need that fancy web framework and could just do the same thing in jQuery and it would work just as well. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. But different frameworks, embedded technologies. Not as many people are using embedded technologies. Other frameworks and libraries. .NET, Python, .NET, RabbitMQ as a technology for message queuing. Spring framework for Java, Apache Kafka, queuing, or not, excuse me, it's a log-based system that's sort of like a queue. Just Flutter, which is for mobile development. PyTorch, Python-based deep learning framework. React Native for building websites that are mobile-friendly. Scikit-learn, Python, TensorFlow, technically C++, but probably most of the people are using it in Python. OpenCV, which is for computer vision, is Python. Qt for those Linux people who aren't living in the terminal all day, and so on. This is a weird mixture of things like Hadoop, .NET MAUI, Keras. The Tidyverse, which is a bunch of our libraries, but just a weird combination of like, let's throw some things on the screen and let's see what's there. Other tools, 60% of people are using Docker, 50% are using NPM, pip, which is Python, Homebrew, macOS, Kubernetes, Yarn, Webpack. Some of this is just going to be this is your application. This is your application's in .NET. You're probably using NuGet. It's in Java. You're probably using Maven. IDEs. This one's kind of interesting. ChatGPT is a tool. Apparently so. Wait, how many of them are using? Oh dear. It's down there. It's down there, Anders. But for IDEs, this shouldn't surprise me. 3/4 of Stack Overflow users who answered the survey said, hey, I use VS Code a lot. And it makes sense. VS Code has become a dominant system for a lot of different programming languages in a lot of different areas, front end, back end, middle tier database, and data science. So it is more of a general purpose IDE than basically any of the rest of these. You have the split between Vim and NeoVim. So where's the person who's saying I use regular VI and space Emacs? Not just regular Emacs, but actually Emacs in space. I respect that 0.3% of people who are using some variant of Emacs, even though I think they're insane. And so on. You can get all of these results. It's kind of fun to go through. Operating system, Windows, 60% personal use, just under half professional use. Mac OS, 30%. Ubuntu, 27%. That's interesting. I will call that interesting. Somebody's using Haiku in production. As far as AI search and developer tools, I'm actually surprised GitHub Copilot is not higher. But I suppose ChatGPT is free and Copilot is not free. So that's probably the difference. I feel bad for the people who are using Google Gemini to try to learn. Although Gemini will teach you things like how many rocks per day is good for a balanced diet. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing because I think we can call it. We have reached the end of the hour. It is now 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to wrap things up for tonight. We don't have a meeting tomorrow night, so our next meeting will be the second Tuesday of August. So until we do see each other at the next TriPass meeting, which you can all find all of those at meetup.com/TriPass. Until we see each other in a future video or meeting or whatever, everybody, take care.